Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to Prehistoric Kingdom. It's currently nighttime here and you're just getting a brief glimpse of our time-lapse here in our Coelophysis habitat, which is today's speed build. I'm really looking forward to this one. It is a shorter video than usual because I've had a very busy week, so we've had to cram a lot in for today's video. But you can see we've got some custom barriers here with some nice fences, a lovely walkway going all the way around, as well as a nice little waterway that wraps around the entire habitat, just giving our guests a little bit of extra security, because if the Coelophysis get out, they will catch you. They are absolute speed demons, and that made it very difficult to track them when it came to recording our end of build tour. Yeah, so you can see that there's been quite a bit, and today we're going to cover the beginnings and how we designed this little barrier, as well as all of the foliage, the little bit of rock work that we've done in here. And yeah, also another thing I forgot to mention was you can actually get some dung beetle nests that will clean your habitat for free, which saves you a lot of clicking and all of that sort of stuff. It's just a shame we don't have keepers yet to restock those feeders. Although in terms of this, it's probably a good thing that we don't have keepers to restock the feeders, because they have no way to access this little island here. That's another thing we may need to improve. You will see later on we build a little bit of a hard shelter for these guys, but they can't actually reach it because they can't travel in deep water, which there is a bit of deep water that separates the enclosure with the hard shelter that we have in there as well. But this habitat could then be adapted. We could move all of these guys into a new enclosure and bring in something new, perhaps a larger carnivore when we finally unlock them. But yeah, that's pretty much all I've got to say for this one. So I hope you enjoy the build, and I will catch you in there when we talk a little bit more about it. So the first thing we want to do is level out our ground here, and we're just digging a big trench all the way around that matches up with our path. This was really simple. The tools are pretty intuitive, very much the same way as you do with Planet Zoo. It's really easy and you can get a lot done quite quickly. As well, the smooth tools can be a little bit temperamental. The way it works with Prehistoric Kingdom is you can see the highlighted circle in the middle. That is basically the radius, so everything within that area will be kind of like 100%, and everything on the outside will kind of fade out to 0%. So it can be a bit tricky and a bit difficult to get used to, but once you get the hang of it, it's pretty easy, and it makes for a very intuitive, like I already said, and useful system of building. Anyway, the main structure of this was going to be a big concrete barrier that runs all the way around, and then we're then going to fill in that trench with water so that we can actually have like a really nice protective area all the way around. My main vision is to actually turn this into a habitat for a larger carnivore, potentially a T-Rex or something of that nature. So we want to put in a nice bit of safety and have enough of a distance between our guests and the animal that's in there, because at the moment the Coelophysis, they're pretty small, so our guests are probably going to have a difficult time seeing them through all of the thick vegetation that we end up putting in. Anyway, we use our scaling tool to adjust these angular steel girders, and that basically forms up the standard structure of our exterior. Now, as you can see, we've got some terrain matching here to do, and I tried very hard to actually pull the terrain so I could have it all at one level, and unfortunately it hasn't worked, and that's probably because I put my path in first, so the terrain won't actually adjust accordingly. That means we had to make a little bit of a step system here on our outer barrier, but thankfully with the floor pieces here being walkable by our guests, they'll actually walk onto that barrier, that flooring piece, and walk along our new walkway here. So essentially we've got a path and then a custom walkway for our guests, which means if we have another habitat flanking this, we'll be able to have plenty of space for our guests to maneuver. Next up, I wanted to make a custom fence, and this involved using some square metal pieces and then some smaller pieces there just to create a bit more of a fence. I could have used mesh here, and I did play around with using mesh, but it didn't look amazing and it kind of obstructed the view more than I would have liked it to. So I went with these steel beam barriers here, and we run this all the way along. Now obviously the Coelophysis, they can't jump or anything, so they're not in any danger of escaping, but I wanted to make a nice, really really like detailed and enclosed space to make it seem as if, whilst there's a lot of danger present, guests are pretty safe here. The Coelophysis are very fast and they are our first carnivore, so if they were to escape, they would have absolutely no hesitation in hunting down our guests and turning them into dinner. And as you can see, once we'd put the fence in, we just needed to match this all the way up to our barriers. Now, I could have made life easier for myself and made some smaller, less, well, not as long barriers here, and just attached them to the concrete structure and then duplicated this all as one. But because I wanted to make some adjustments and stuff and actually have some slightly longer fences in here, it would be a little bit of a better idea to actually just have them as two separate structures, which is why I went with that method. It did take up a little bit more time than I would have liked, and I did have to get a little bit creative at this section here, making two smaller fence posts, but once that was done, we were in with a nice little run here. And obviously it just means that I can keep this fence in an actual constant height, so the fence is actually the same height all the way around, despite the fact that the actual barriers and the concrete structure here dips up and down, and we have that stepping system in for our guests. So it just made everything uniform, I guess, in the end, because we could have the fences all at the same height, which meant in places they would obviously be higher where our walkway dips down, but they'd also kind of have that uniformity going all the way around the top of the habitat, which was really nice and something I was looking for. Of course, these could do with a little bit more detail, so we could have some extra things put on the concrete themselves. We could make some nice adjustments to the walkway, and that will come, because I think it's probably going to be a good idea at some point to do very much like I do in the Planet Zoo videos, where we just adjust things and put in some extra little guest enrichment pieces. But yeah, I was pretty happy with how this one all turned out. Next, we put some lights on the top, just some emergency red lights here. They went in sequence all the way around with gaps of one, so one had a light on them, one didn't, and we just carried that on all the way around, and it looked really cool. It just gave a nice little pop of light. Next, it was all about terrain painting. Now, this is quite difficult. I find sometimes with the terrain painting here, you don't quite get a nice merge between certain textures, so it can be quite difficult to get it right. But after some playing around, I did eventually get a piece that I was happy with, and this was basically all about mapping out where we were going to put our foliage. So here, where we have our sand and our substrate pieces, is where we're going to have a lot of foliage, and then the open space is going to remain grassy and field-like, because we are going to need some field. Now, these guys can have a lot of forest, which was really good and worked in my favor, because it meant we could come in with our brushes. And we start with some of the smaller terrain here. We're using coastal brushes here, getting in some nice light coverage there, and then in some of the patches of green we put in thicker vegetation with some forests, and we just mixed it up, used all four pieces of terrain. Now, what I did notice was our Coelophysis, they do need some desert stuff as well, so we switched and used some of the desert oasis foliage a bit later on, just to finish that all off. Coming over here, I did want to put in a bit of an enclosure here so that we had some hard shelter. Now, the Coelophysis, they don't seem to have a requirement for hard shelter, so it's not actually a huge issue. A lot of them just sleep out in the open, which is really nice, and you would kind of expect that with a lot of dinosaurs. They don't actually need a lot of hard shelter because they just kind of sleep out in the open. They didn't have that. Dinosaurs were too big to seek out caves. Obviously, you've got your smaller ones like the Dilophosaurus and stuff. They do kind of take to the safety of caves to avoid larger predators, but our Coelophysis, they don't seem to have any kind of hard shelter requirement, which is good. So we built up these rocks so that they were kind of level with the fences here. Now, I'm not sure if we're going to get jumping requirements and stuff introduced in the game at any point, but you would imagine that the Coelophysis do have a little bit of a leap on them, especially if they're running at speed. So I wanted to build up some rocks here, and then we could put in our hard shelter. Now, it was mainly just so that I had some sort of staff area here, just in the event that we eventually get staff put in the game. And what I could do is build a little bit of a rock walkway that goes all the way across here and links up with our staff building. We do have a feeder here, and we do have some bedding in the staff building. It is just one of the stock buildings. I've not actually started building my own yet, but that will come when I've got a bit more time. So once again, we used this nice modular piece here. We duplicated it and moved it into position so that the entrance was kind of backing out there. And we do end up adjusting the path just to make life a little bit easier and make things look a little bit more more straight on, because at the moment you can see it's a bit angular, which isn't great. So we made a concrete slab there that we put a feeder on. We extended the rockwork further into the enclosure so that we had a little bit of a overlap there, just pulling everything up. It was all duplicated, and what we ended up doing was just highlighting a few rocks in that section and changing the texture on them. So a little bit of path adjustment going on here. I did run into a little bit of trouble curving the path, and then of course having this issue here where we'd made some terrain adjustments. We then couldn't put our path back in, which is strange because it allowed us to do the terrain adjustments in the first place, but maybe that's just a little quirk of the game. Of course, I didn't want my path to have that little weird sticky out bit, so we had to make some adjustments, which meant, very simply, smoothing out the terrain so that I could put the path back in and then removing the terrain underneath again. It was easy, and it wasn't as time consuming as I expected it to be, which is really good. So last thing to do was to attach this final barrier to the edge. Now this does look a little bit janky. I don't quite like the angle it's coming off out at. We might actually need to just adjust the whole fence a little bit and just line it all up a little bit nicer. But there we go, we've kind of got an area now that looks a little bit more flat and has less of an angular structure to it. Now obviously we could do a little bit more again with the barrier running alongside here, but I put my null barrier back in and then used one of the stock in-game barriers just to tighten it all up and link it into another null barrier. That just sealed off the habitat and made everything look really nice and complete. We then did our little terrain painting on the rocks just to add a little bit of variation, and I think this is such a cool feature. Like with Planet Zoo, you'd be playing around with different types of rocks and stuff, whereas here you've just got those rocks that you can change the texture of, and you can add a little bit of moss on the top as well. There's also desert and snow if you were so inclined, and it just makes things a lot easier. Now the next thing to do was to just adjust some of the harsh contrast between our staff building there and the actual terrain itself. We put in some steps that our dinosaurs would use, made them concrete. Now unfortunately, after playing around a little bit, we could not quite get the numbers matching up in terms of our colour palette. They were exactly the same as the concrete slabs there that you can walk on, but for some reason our concrete steps were not changing, so I had to make a few adjustments just to try and get a little bit of a colour match there. But once that was done, it had a really nice kind of feel to it. All we needed to do now was put in a few more rocks here just to add some sort of structure to the terrain and smooth out the ground around the steps, because that was a little bit of a weird texture formality there. Of course, when we came to do this, we ended up creating a little bit of a gap, and this was again another tight adjustment that we finally got right. But you can see there the tiny little gap, just the smallest of things making our life a little bit difficult. But once we'd sorted all of that out, eventually getting it nice and uniform, we could put in a tiny little bit more foliage with the ferns and little brushes there. And then we had to put in some generators. We just ran some backup generators all the way along and thought about doing a solar farm, but actually looking at them, they don't actually increase the range at which you have power, which is a bit of a shame. It would be nice to have power lines brought in. I think that would be a really cool feature. Obviously we've got that in Jurassic World Evolution, and it would be really nice to see that in this game. I just think it would make things a lot easier. In fact, I think Planet Zoo should have power lines as well, because you do have a lot of power that you need to kind of think about, and it's just that extra management mini game that you could really do without. So once we'd had those generators in, it was time to just finish everything off. We threw in a few more Coelophysis. I think we've got about 15 in here now, and once they were in, the habitat was good to go. So we're almost approaching our tour, and like I said, it's a little bit bitty because these guys are quite difficult to keep up with, but I really hope you enjoyed this slightly shorter episode of Prehistoric Kingdom. Hopefully this week we will still have another Planet Zoo for you to sink your teeth into. Thank you all for watching. Make sure you drop me a like if you're new here, subscribe as well, I would really appreciate it. Drop me a comment on what you want to see next in Prehistoric Kingdom. Thanks for watching, bye bye.